High above the Pacific Ocean, the drone of four massive engines broke the silence of the early morning. It was August in the year 1945, and the world held its breath without knowing the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Inside the silver fuselage of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, named Enola Gay, Colonel Paul Tibbets and his crew focused on their instruments with intense concentration. They carried a single weapon of unprecedented power, a device that harnessed the fundamental forces of the universe. The air was thick with tension as the bomber approached the Japanese coastline. Below them lay the city of Hiroshima, waking up to a warm summer day unaware that the course of human history was about to change forever. The stakes could not have been higher for the Allied forces and the Empire of Japan. Years of brutal island-hopping warfare had brought the United States military to the doorstep of the Japanese home islands. Every previous battle had been fought with ferocious intensity, and the casualty rates were climbing at an alarming speed. Military planners in Washington anticipated that a full-scale invasion of Japan known as Operation Downfall would result in millions of deaths on both sides. The war in Europe had ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany, but the Pacific Theater remained a cauldron of violence. The leadership in Tokyo showed no signs of capitulation, preparing their citizens to fight until the bitter end against the encroaching enemy forces. At the center of this technological and moral precipice stood J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant physicist who led the Manhattan Project. For years, he and a team of the greatest scientific minds had labored in the secret laboratories of Los Alamos, New Mexico. They worked under a shroud of absolute secrecy, driven by the fear that Nazi Germany might develop a nuclear weapon first. Oppenheimer was a complex figure plagued by the weight of what they were creating, yet driven by the scientific imperative to unlock the secrets of the atom. His leadership turned abstract theories into a terrifying reality. The gadget they built was not just a bomb, it was a force of nature, contained within a metal shell, waiting to be unleashed. The question that haunted President Harry Truman and his advisors was whether this new weapon would actually work in a combat situation. The Trinity test in the New Mexico desert had been a success, but deploying such a device over an enemy city was a completely different challenge. There were doubts about the fusing mechanisms and the aerodynamics of the bomb casing. Furthermore, there was the agonizing question of whether the destruction of a city would be enough to force the Japanese surrender. If the bomb failed, or if the Japanese resolve remained unbroken, the war would drag on for years. The decision rested on a knife edge, balancing the certainty of invasion casualties against the unknown horror of atomic warfare. The answer came with a blinding flash that erased the center of Hiroshima in an instant. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomb known as Little Boy detonated above the city. The explosion created a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun, vaporizing everything in its immediate vicinity. A massive shockwave leveled buildings for miles, reducing the bustling metropolis to a wasteland of ash and rubble. Tens of thousands of people died instantly, and many more would suffer from the effects of radiation in the days and years to come. The mushroom cloud that rose into the stratosphere served as a grim signal that the age of conventional warfare had ended and a perilous new era had begun. This cataclysmic event was the culmination of years of covert operations and scientific breakthroughs. The Manhattan Project had begun quietly with a letter from Albert Einstein to President Franklin Roosevelt warning of the potential for uranium bombs. What followed was an industrial effort of staggering proportions, involving sites across the United States from Oak Ridge, Tennessee to Hanford, Washington. Thousands of workers processed uranium and plutonium, often without knowing the true purpose of their labor. The project consumed vast resources and the energy of a nation determined to end the conflict. It was a race against time and physics, with the fate of the free world hanging in the balance. Before the bombs could be used, the political stage had to be set at the Potsdam Conference in occupied Germany. President Truman met with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and British Prime Ministers Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee to decide the post-war order. It was here that Truman received the coded message indicating the success of the Trinity test. Emboldened by this news, he issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan. The declaration warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused, but it did not specifically mention the atomic bomb. The Allied leaders hoped that the threat alone would be enough to bring the Japanese government to the negotiating table. The Japanese government, however, was divided between those who wanted to seek peace and the hardline militarists who wished to continue the war. When the Potsdam Declaration arrived, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki used the term mokusatsu, which was interpreted by the Allies as a dismissal or a refusal to comment. This miscommunication, or perhaps calculated defiance, sealed the fate of the Japanese cities. The military leaders in Tokyo believed they could bleed the American forces during an invasion and negotiate better terms. They did not comprehend that the United States now possessed a weapon that made resistance futile. This tragic misunderstanding paved the way for the mission of the Enola Gay. On the island of Tinian in the Marianas, the 509th Composite Group made their final preparations. This unit had been specially formed and trained for the delivery of nuclear weapons. The B-29 bombers were modified to carry the heavy payloads stripped of their defensive turrets to save weight. The atmosphere on the base was a mix of routine maintenance and high anxiety. The crews knew they were part of something momentous, though few understood the full scientific details. Colonel Tibbets briefed his men, emphasizing the precision required for the mission. They were to fly individually to avoid detection, relying on altitude and speed to escape the blast zone. The flight of the Enola Gay was long and uneventful until the final approach. The crew navigated by the stars and the radio beacons across the vast dark ocean. As the sun rose over the Pacific, the bombardier Major Thomas Farabee looked through his bomb sight, searching for the T-shaped A bridge. This landmark in the center of Hiroshima was the aiming point. The weather scouts had reported clear skies, giving the green light for the primary target. The city below was an important military center and port, but it was also full of civilians starting their daily routines. The disconnect between the quiet morning below and the devastation above was absolute. When the bomb was released, the aircraft lurched upward, relieved of the 4-ton weight. Tibbets immediately banked the plane in a sharp turn to put as much distance as possible between them and the detonation. They had 43 seconds before the timer and barometric sensors triggered the explosion. Those seconds stretched out into an eternity for the crew. They wore dark goggles to protect their eyes from the flash. Back on the ground, air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but were cleared, leading many citizens to venture out of their shelters. The timing was a tragic coincidence that maximized the human toll of the attack. The explosion defied description. A brilliant white light filled the sky, followed by a heat wave that ignited wood and paper houses instantly. The shockwave moved faster than the speed of sound, crushing concrete buildings and tossing vehicles like toys. Within minutes, a massive firestorm engulfed the city, fueled by the updrafts from the rising heat. The iconic mushroom cloud billowed upwards, piercing the clouds and spreading radioactive material into the atmosphere. From the cockpit of the Enola Gay, the crew looked back in awe and horror at the churning mass of smoke and debris that had replaced the city. News of the attack reached Washington while President Truman was crossing the Atlantic aboard the USS Augusta. He immediately authorized a press release to inform the American public and the world. The statement revealed the existence of the atomic bomb and warned the Japanese that they could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the likes of which had never been seen on this earth. The announcement was intended to shock the Japanese leadership into immediate surrender. It also served as a message to the Soviet Union, demonstrating the overwhelming military superiority of the United States. The secret of Los Alamos was now headline news across the globe. In Tokyo, the initial reports were confused and fragmentary. Communications with Hiroshima had been completely cut off. It took hours for the Japanese military to send a pilot to investigate the silence. The pilot reported a scar of destruction so vast that it was difficult to comprehend. The Japanese scientists who were consulted quickly realized that an atomic weapon must have been used. Despite this realization, the Supreme War Council remained deadlocked. The militarists argued that the United States could not possibly have more of these bombs, or that they would not use them again. They clung to the hope of a decisive battle on the home islands. While Japan hesitated, the Soviet Union made its move. On August 8, the Soviet foreign minister informed the Japanese ambassador that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan the following day. This was a crushing diplomatic and military blow. Japan had hoped that the Soviets would mediate a peace deal with the Allies. Instead, massive Soviet armored columns smashed into Japanese lines in Manchuria. The Japanese army, which had once been the pride of the empire, was quickly overwhelmed by the veteran Red Army forces. The pincers were closing tight around the island nation from both the east and the west. With no surrender forthcoming, the United States proceeded with the second atomic mission. The target date was moved up to avoid approaching bad weather. The weapon this time was a plutonium implosion bomb named Fat Man, a more complex and powerful device than the uranium bomb used on Hiroshima. The B-29 named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, took off from Tinian, carrying this second harbinger of doom. The mission was plagued by technical issues, including a fuel pump failure that limited their reserve fuel. The primary target was the city of Kokura, home to a massive arsenal. Fate intervened over the skies of Kokura. Smoke from a nearby firebombing raid and heavy cloud cover obscured the target. The orders were strict that the bomb had to be dropped visually, not by radar. After 3 failed passes and with fuel running dangerously low, Sweeney made the decision to divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The city of Nagasaki was a major port and industrial center nestled in a valley. The geography was different from the flat delta of Hiroshima, which would ultimately contain some of the blast effects, but the power of the bomb was greater. As Boxcar approached Nagasaki, the clouds were also thick. The mission was nearly aborted, but at the last moment the bombardier found a break in the clouds. The target point was shifted slightly, but the release was made. Fat Man fell from the sky and detonated over the Urakami Valley. The explosion was equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. The surrounding hills focused the blast wave, destroying the industrial factories and the residential districts alike. The devastation was absolute in the immediate area, although parts of the city shielded by the hills were spared the worst of the direct blast. The destruction of Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet invasion, shattered the remaining resolve of the Japanese leadership. The Emperor Hirohito, who had traditionally remained above politics, decided that the suffering of his people must end. In a rare and unprecedented move, he intervened in the deadlock of the Supreme War Council. He stated that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that the unendurable must be endured. It was a moment of profound historical shift, as the divine ruler stepped down into the realm of mortal decision, making to save his nation from total annihilation. Even with the emperor's decision, there was resistance. Young officers in the military attempted a coup d'état known as the Kyujo Incident. They sought to seize the recording of the emperor's surrender speech and continue the war. Soldiers rampaged through the palace grounds, searching for the vinyl records. The coup ultimately failed as senior leaders refused to join the rebellion. The loyalty to the emperor ultimately outweighed the desire for continued conflict. The recording was smuggled out of the palace, ensuring that the voice of the crane would be heard by the people of Japan. On August 15, the emperor's voice was broadcast over the radio for the first time in history. Most Japanese citizens had never heard him speak, and the formal court language he used was difficult for many to understand. However, the message was clear: the war was over. People gathered around radios in ruined cities and rural villages, weeping not only for the defeat, but also with relief that the bombing would cease. The concept of surrender was alien to the Japanese martial tradition, but the reality of the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion left no other choice. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony, representing the Allied powers. Japanese officials dressed in formal morning coats and military uniforms signed the instrument of surrender. The deck of the mighty ship was crowded, with sailors and officers witnessing the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history. Above them, hundreds of carrier planes and B-29 bombers flew in formation, a final display of the overwhelming air power that had decided the war. The aftermath of the bombings presented a new and horrifying medical challenge. Doctors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were overwhelmed by patients with mysterious symptoms. People who had appeared uninjured initially began to lose their hair, bleed from their gums, and suffer from extreme fatigue. This was acute radiation sickness, a condition that was poorly understood at the time. The hospitals themselves had been destroyed, and many medical personnel were among the dead. The suffering of the Hibakusha, the survivors of the bomb, became a lasting legacy of the attacks. The physical rebuilding of Japan began immediately under the occupation of Allied forces. General MacArthur established a headquarters in Tokyo and began the process of demilitarizing and democratizing the nation. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rose from the ashes, constructing peace memorial parks to honor the victims. The resilience of the Japanese people was remarkable as they cleared the rubble and built modern cities on the sites of the tragedy. The new constitution renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation, setting Japan on a path of pacifism and economic recovery. The use of the atomic bombs also signaled the start of the Cold War. The monopoly on nuclear weapons held by the United States was short-lived. The Soviet Union accelerated its own program, detonating its first atomic bomb in 1949. The specter of nuclear annihilation would hang over the world for decades to come, shaping international relations and military strategy. The two superpowers engaged in an arms race, building arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. The fear that began in the skies over Japan became a permanent feature of global politics. Historians and ethicists continue to debate the necessity and morality of the bombings. Supporters argue that the bombs ended the war quickly and saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers who would have died in an invasion. They point to the fanatical resistance on Okinawa and Iwo Jima as evidence of what was to come. Critics contend that Japan was already on the verge of collapse and that the bombings were intended more as a warning to the Soviet Union than a military necessity. They argue that targeting civilian populations with such indiscriminate weapons was a war crime. Regardless of the debate, the dropping of the atomic bombs remains a watershed moment in human history. It was the point where humanity gained the ability to bring about its own extinction. The images of the mushroom clouds and the shadows burned into the pavement serve as eternal warnings. They remind us of the terrible cost of total war and the responsibility that comes with scientific advancement. The stories of the survivors serve as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. The legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not just one of destruction, but also one of peace activism. The cities have become centers for the global movement to abolish nuclear weapons. Every year, ceremonies are held to remember the victims and to call for a world free of such armaments. The paper cranes folded by Sadako Sasaki, a young girl who died of leukemia caused by the bomb, became a symbol of this hope. Her story and the stories of others ensure that the world does not forget the reality of nuclear warfare. As we look back on the events of 1945, we see a world transformed. The end of World War II brought about the United Nations and a new international order. It also brought the realization that nations must work together to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. The delicate balance of peace is maintained by the memory of what happened on those clear August mornings. The silence that followed the explosions still echoes in the conscience of the world. The journey from the secret labs of Los Alamos to the skies over Japan was one of scientific triumph and human tragedy. It involved the greatest minds and the bravest pilots, but it resulted in the deaths of countless innocents. The duality of the atomic age is that the same energy that destroys cities can also power them. The challenge for future generations is to harness this power responsibly. The shadow of the bomb is long, but the light of understanding can push it back. Today, the Enola Gay sits in a museum, a silent artifact of a violent past. It is a polished aluminum reminder of the day the sky turned into fire. Visitors walk around its fuselage, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the mission it undertook. It stands not just as a machine of war, but as a pivotal object in the timeline of civilization. It represents the threshold we crossed and can never step back from. The history it carries is heavy with the souls of the lost. In the end, the story of the atomic bombs is a story about choices. The choice to build the weapon, the choice to use it, and the choice to surrender. It is a narrative filled with what-ifs and difficult decisions made under extreme pressure. The leaders of the time were operating in a world of total war, where the lines between combatant and civilian had been blurred. Their actions shaped the world we live in today for better or for worse. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought a definitive end to World War II. It stopped the bleeding of a world at war, but it opened a wound that has never fully healed. The events of August 1945 stand as a somber monument to the destructive potential of mankind. As we move forward into an uncertain future, we must carry the lessons of the past with us. We must remember the blinding light and the dark shadows, ensuring that the whispers of time do not fade into silence.